Abstract by Timo Hannes. In the first morning hours of April 12, 1961, at precisely 0107 TST, several small charges of pyrotechnics were ignited somewhere in the far steppes of a state that had once been known as the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic. The process of this ignition, followed by the subsequent explosion of these charges, might not have been deemed all that historically important, had they not provided the sparks that would start the 4RD-107 and Sol RD-108 engine of the same Vostok K rocket that, only minutes later, made Yuri Gagarin the first human to have left the tangible bounds of Earth's atmosphere and entered the cold void of space. For a period of 89 minutes and 6 seconds, Yuri Gagarin... What you just heard were the first introductory words to Timo Hannes' landmark study, An Introduction to the Rykani. Written close to the end of his life, and in cooperation with a supporting research team measuring well over 1,000 human and a single Rykani head, it was this study that gave humanity its first concise look into the species of the Rykani, and as such, it marks a great starting point to our own exploration of the Rykani. Welcome to the second episode of the Rykani-Cast. Glad to have you back with us. Now, after the last episode, where we talked all about the Interspecies Cultural Research Association, the Ascendancy's main organ of human study on the Rykani, we will now turn to their main point of research, that being the Rykani themselves. Of course, the Rykani species, in its enormous totality, offers us a vast quantity of topics to cover, so the second episode of the Rykani-Cast will simply focus on the most essential basics of Rykani knowledge that will set us up for what is to come. Later episodes will then eventually go into details about their biology, sociology, culture, physiology, and many other topics. But in this episode, we'll just take it slow and familiarize ourselves with the Rykani on a surface level, looking at the most important elements of their phenotype, their culture, some of their quirky habits, and parts of their early history. The beginning of today's tale takes place far above the bustling human colony of Kans in the last days of the year 3109 CE. There and then, in orbit over the quickly rising skyscrapers of this third major human settlement, rested a medium-sized interstellar spacecraft, the Skylab-built SL Nerissa. Through its novel multi-propulsion approach, SL Nerissa would soon carry the renowned astronomers pair Hani and Itzhak Fazi, as well as several thousand other human scientists, along on the most expedient and most ambitious interstellar expedition humanity had ever undertaken. Their target was a star system by the name of Mulnia, to you perhaps better known under its stellar catalog name Gliese 637 or Henry Draper 157 881. The planets orbiting the K7V class star at its core had so far resisted any attempts at human colonization, and in fact, previous automated expeditions had revealed that all 4 of the system's major rocky planets were categorically unsuited to human habitation. Still, a status of unsuitable for human habitation didn't inescapably mean that the planets within were incapable of being made habitable by humans. And so, the expedition set off trying to figure out what measures exactly would be required to make Mulnia the 24th system harboring a permanent human residence. After a record-breaking 19 years journey, the Hani Itzhak expedition had intended to spend the following decades exploring all facets of the Mulnia system. Their goals included taking measurements of solar activity, surveying all planets of the system, and trying to find plausible avenues and likely candidates for new terraforming initiatives. However, despite these noble goals of assisting humanity's expansion across the unsettled stars of the Milky Way, it would be by nothing more than pure chance that subsequent generations would curse this most recent human endeavor as a harbinger of chaos, death, disease, destruction, and war. Once the SL Nerissa's final deceleration measures had been completed in mid-July 3129 CE, its human cargo quickly went to work. But despite initial excitement and high hopes, the first 3 years of serving would consistently fail to produce the results and news that were desired. While the star of Molniya itself, at least, managed to achieve a far better solar stability rating than had previously been predicted, none of the 5 observed rocky planetoids in its orbit possessed an atmosphere of more than 100th the density of Earth's, which dampened all hopes for the potential future terraforming considerably. As the human habitability ratings for Molniya's planets had to be adjusted downwards further and further, month after month, a certain melancholy set in across the expedition. By the middle of its 3rd year, some members openly voiced their wishes for an early return to Khans, while others still suggested that the team's focus should shift towards an economic viability study of potential future metal extraction sites. Stuck between a two-minded crew and faced with the total failure of their mission, the Fasi couple retreated from public view, while the unrest within the expedition grew with each passing day. By the morning of October 13th, 3132 CE, both Hania and Itzhak had already come to terms with the inevitability of both their shameful retreat back home and of the public scrutiny that the immense cost of their failed undertaking would draw upon them. Indeed, all hope had long since seemed lost, when fate suddenly decided to intervene. On this October morning, within the perimeter of a small temporary pressurized human settlement on the surface of Molniya II, a discovery of enough vehemence as to change the course of human history forever would be made. And all the events that led up to this critical moment had their start in the dark of Molniya II's previous rotation, just hours ago. During that night, without attracting anyone's notice, 2 creatures of a completely unknown origin and species had snuck into the small human habitation module, wherein they spent the next few hours extensively photographing and documenting their findings from within parts of the base's expansive air recycling infrastructure network. Yet, despite their sneaky ingress, the 2 feathery miscreants soon ran into serious trouble during their attempted second operation of the depressurization mechanism that sat between the human breathable air of the module and the near airless vacuum of Molniya II's surface. Despite any and all efforts, the outside door failed to budge at the interlopers' attempts of escape, a result of what is now believed to have been the intermittent cessation of an incorrectly maintained compressor engine. Inescapably locked into the temporary human settlement, and with their own reserves of compositionally distinct, breathable air quickly running low, the 2 intruders eventually saw no way of escape other than to reveal their existence to the humans inside the colony. After exposing themselves from behind 2 large air filters, the trespassers desperately sought out for any humans capable of helping them. Very soon afterwards, the resulting commotion drew the attention of none other than the 2 expedition leaders, Hania and Itzhak, who had just completed their morning walk. All subsequently written after-action transcripts described the following few minutes as equal parts shocking and confusing. Upon seeing the expedition leaders, the 2 outsiders, without delay, introduced themselves in perfect New Pantaran and claimed to be members of a species they called the Rykani. Possessing all customary politeness and a perfect grasp of human linguistics, they asked the 2 expedition leaders to please open the door to the outside for them and to peacefully allow them to leave. In exchange, the 2 Rykani offered to come back to the human settlement, together with the rest of their group, once they had refilled their air reserves, at which point they would introduce their species more adequately and explain their property right violating actions to the members of the human expedition. Stunned by the sheer tremendousness of this discovery and egged on by the insistent begging from the 2 members of this newly discovered alien species, Itzhak saw no other choice but to agree to the terms of the 2 intruders. He quickly ordered an inspection of the pressurized door, and within minutes allowed the pair to take their leave. Unblinkingly, he wished both intruders well on their journey as they ran off in a panicked hurry. The 2 Rykani left, never to return to the settlement, Some humans supposedly reported seeing a futuristic-looking vessel lift off at a great distance some several minutes later. However, as the described craft varied wildly in its shape, size, and motion between all these accounts, none of them were ever officially confirmed. Fully overwhelmed by the sudden unexpected discovery of an alien life form, Itzhak and Hanya together ordered an immediate end to their shared expedition, and within days set the crew out back towards Kans. For the next 27 years, the vast majority of all humans lived in complete ignorance of this momentous discovery. However, even after the unannounced return of SL Nerissa to Kans's orbit in 3159 CE, after its journey of almost 5 decades, the Kans system's population was still the only part of humanity to have a complete picture of the fundamental shift that had just taken place for all of mankind. As it would later turn out, the Rykani had known about and observed humanity for at least several hundreds of thousands of years ahead of their discovery on Molnia II, although the exact time frame of the first visit to Earth still remains unknown. Throughout all this time, an unofficial consensus had apparently ruled across Rykani society, dictating that humanity was an oddity to simply be watched, but not to be touched. However, the serious fumble of the two Rykani on Molnia II, whose names still remain unknown to this day, tore this code of conduct asunder. The illusion was breached. Humanity now knew of its silent observers, and the tales of Hanya and Itzhak's discovery first spread across the planet of Kans, and eventually across a growing number of human-inhabited systems. The Rykani then also quickly took note of humanity's newfound knowledge. Within weeks of SL Nerissa's return to Kans, the first reports and recordings of unknown spacecraft orbiting the different satellites of Kans's star littered the local news stations. From there on out, encounters with the Rykani became an increasingly common occurrence for human space travelers and explorers, many of whom would soon end up exceedingly disappointed after finding out that their alien encounter had been too late to make history. Just like that, a many millennia old Rykani jig was up, and humanity's life in the lonely universe came to an end. As one would expect, the existence of the Rykani came as a shock to humanity. However, it was not just the existence of an intelligent alien species, their possession of seemingly impossible technology, or their perfect handling of the new Pantaran language, but most distinctly the biological features of this newly discovered race that caused the shock to soon culminate into widespread pandemonium. Let us now turn back to Timo Hannes' work for his description of the events that followed the first human Rykani encounter, and for a more thorough discussion of the Rykani species. It was under these circumstances that humanity first came into contact with the Rykani. Of course, Itzhak Fazi and his team have since made repeated mention of the strange impression this alien kind made on its first encounter. After all, in a very general sense, the Rykani share tremendous similarities with us humans. So striking were these similarities, upon first description, in fact, that researchers of the time immediately ruled out the possibility of a convergent evolution having taken place. In their minds, such similarities were definitive proof of our kinds either having a shared genetic ancestor, or of our species having been a product of intelligent design. For the first 3 decades that followed, any divergences from these lines of thinking were heavily frowned upon by the biologist community at large. Certainly, the most significant reason for what we would now consider to have been a childish and foolish reaction by lead scientists of the time appears obvious at first sight. The Rykani are a species that shares many structural similarities with us humans. They possess 2 ears, 2 eyes, a single mouth, 2 arms, as well as 2 legs, and while their bone structures and musculature layouts show many notable internal differences, the general format of their kind can be described by few words, other than distinctly humanoid. Yet, the Rykani are not human, neither in the totality of their shape, nor in the expression of their spirit. They don't share our genetic code, they don't share our chemical makeup, they don't share our habits, our culture, our physiology, our sociology, or psychology. Despite any outside similarities, humanity was quickly forced into admitting that the Rika did, in fact, evolve on a world far distant from poor Earth. Once the initial hysteria is calmed, we are obligated, time and time again, to take note of Rykani expressions which proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that their kind was just distantly humanoid in shape, and nothing more. Of course, even with these aforementioned similarities, many great divergences that have resulted from our galactically separated evolutions are obvious at first sight. Starting with the Rykani exterior, we are immediately met by the most notable divergence between our species. The Rika are covered by what could neither be described as fur, nor necessarily as feathers, as we earthbound races know them. Most researchers in our team have taken up the habit of calling this Rykani covering feathers, simply for a lack of a more adequate term. However, it should be noted that these quasi-feathers share practically no structural similarity with most types of feathers found covering reptilian or avian species on Earth. The closest approximation to the average Rykani feather would be the avian phyloplume, but once more, all similarities end at the surface level. See Appendices 17a and b. Rykani feathers come in a great variety of colors, sizes, and shapes, and all of them are markedly soft and warm to the touch. From our initial observations, our team has been able to identify two major structural varieties of these quasi-feathers. The first kind is mostly found along the Rykani head, their legs, upper arms, and tail. The quasi-veins of these feathers possess a certain degree of structural rigidity, and are supplied for their flexible hollow shafts with the acidic Rykani blood. The remainder of the Rykani plumage is made up of a second, more flexible type of these quasi-feathers. They are mostly non-perforated and spread out from their shafts like branches on a tree. The removal of both types of these quasi-feathers has been described to us as not only being markedly painful in execution, but also, in the eyes of many Rika, as being a complete cultural taboo and theory. Similarly, a Rykani assistant has referred to suggested notions of cutting or trimming the Rykani plumage as both indecent and offensive, which gives us reasonable ground to assume that all acts of destructively altering the growth of a Rika's coverings fall outside their bounds of cultural acceptability. If we furthermore contemplate the corresponding statements made by our assistant, as are surmised in the later chapters of this report, it seems as though the Rika have developed a ubiquitous cultural consensus on the unacceptability of destructive modification of their plumage. Non-destructive measures, however, such as coloring or covering of these quasi-feathers, appear not only widely permissible, but even generally encouraged by at least a large share of the many divergent Rykani planetary cultures. In this regard, the Rykani habit of coloring their quasi-feathers makes for an interesting observation as it pertains to several other notable aspects of the Rykani culture, sociology, psychology, and, most interesting of all, the topic of Rykani sexuality. Just as one would expect from any species of their size, the Rika reproduce sexually, and, just like us humans, their kind can also be divided into two distinct sexes, that being the seminal fluid-producing ko and the egg sac-laying ke. For entirely functional purposes, and to make a reading of the later parts of the scientific paper easier, the researchers of our team hereby propose that the Rykani ke be treated like the human female in our language, and the ko be treated as human males. Our position on this topic is primarily derived from the Rykani developed translations of their disparate dialects into some of our human languages, such as New Pentarran, Terran, Reformed Eastern, Xianyu, and Prospera. This Rykani translation framework was developed even before our initial mutual contact and has been used for all of our bidirectional communications ever since the Rika became known to us. As the system has been observed to apply the aforementioned arrangement in all human languages containing sex-based inflections, our team has judged a continued acceptance of this treatment to be a preferable path of least cultural and linguistic friction between our kinds. The linguistics division of this research group has stated its explicit approval of the same treatment following several prolonged debates on the topic and a detailed examination of precedents set by the ways our surviving human languages refer to males and females of other non-human species. Additionally, when questioned on the topic, our own Rykani research assistant, the esteemed Makove has also voiced her own tacit approval to the idea. However, this approval was further accompanied by a more pressing statement, which relayed to us in no uncertain words that the Rykani species likely won't care for the linguistic treatment of their race regardless of our final choice. For a transcription of Makove complete and uncensored statements on the topic, see Appendix 18. Appendix 18, a debate on sexual linguistics between senior assistant researcher Makove and senior researcher Simon Tang.
Well, given the choice between all of our propositions, do you as an individual have any preferences?
Nah.
Are you sure?
Yeah, I don't care.
Okay, well, this whole topic has been a huge sticking point for our linguistics department, and I bet they like to have your input on the whole situation.
God, who cares? And why do we have to talk about this for so long? Yesterday, we talked about spaceships and racing and human ground racing and accidents and all that cool stuff. But now, this?
Well,
this is what you've got in store for me today. Really?
Well, it's kind of a huge deal for us right now, so...
Why? That's so stupid.
Look, I agree, but...
Oh, what? Do they really think that they're gonna be talking to the cow one day, and all of a sudden they kill you cool will tell them, I don't like how you refer to my sex in your language?
Well, I suppose that's their fear.
God!
So, you consider that fear to be unfounded?
No, I consider them to be fucking stupid. Who cares? We don't care about your weird gobbledygook human language. We don't even want to hear it. It sounds weird and disgusting.
Makove?
I don't ever want to hear human language again. It sounds stupid.
Makove?
I'm not going to talk about this stuff anymore. I'm only going to talk about racing from now on.
Well, Makove, that means I won't be able to hand a full report over to the linguistics department, and...
Good. That means we're done here. And that means that you can talk about human sports car racing again. Talk about the big crashes on Keys. You said yesterday you were going to tell me about it.
No, Makove, I said I'd tell you about it if you behaved and if we managed to get done ahead of schedule.
And we're done here. So, speak your wisdom, human. I want to hear it.
Fine.
Without a doubt, such a reaction could have been expected when discussing the matter with members of the Rykani species, if one considers that the primary language, together with at least a small number of its subsets that we've managed to observe and document, don't diverge in treatment based on the sex of any given individual. At the same time, however, it should be noted that the Rykani language does discriminate based on both the species of a given subject as well as based on an individual's method of conception, that being either through biological procreation or digital instantiation. Sadly, not a single one of our many human languages currently offers us a framework to transcribe such distinctions accurately, meaning that the creation of a mechanism for more accurate translations of the Rykani language will no doubt be a major topic of research in the centuries to come. The necessity for such a mechanism also becomes apparent if one wishes to discuss the related distinctions between the words Ryka and Rykani, both of which are used almost interchangeably by the Rykan reference to their own species, but not entirely so. While neither of these two words fully expresses the same concept as the other, there exists no human language capable of transcribing the minute differences in the usages and meanings into a human legible format. Once again, we are forced to look at the Rykani-developed translation frameworks for guidance. Across all observed Rykani human translations, the word Ryka was used as a noun, while the word Rykani was handled like an adjective. This usage mechanism, which takes on an almost comforting appearance through its accommodation of our humanoid linguistic peculiarities, is of course highly inaccurate. However, since it has become clear to our research teams that the Rykani vocalization framework takes the shape of a completely independently developed approach to a consummate verbal communication system, instead of just simply another language in the form we humans conceive of them, we have reached a consensus on the need for a temporary but complete adaptation of the partially inaccurate Rykani-made translation framework, at least until a better option presents itself. Once more, the current necessity of traveling along the path of least potential misunderstanding and friction with the Rika has been a chief prerogative in the formation of this consensus. We yield further discussion on this topic to researchers of the newer generations, some of whom will sooner or later hopefully specialize themselves on interspecies linguistics and perhaps offer a more equitable solution to these issues. Additionally, we will also leave the entire topic of Rykani sexual reproduction aside for the remainder of this abstract, as a sensible discussion of this issue requires a thorough understanding of the Rykani biology, their sociology, and their psychology. At this point, it is only proper for us to relate that our Rykani research assistant has repeatedly, and in no uncertain terms, spoken of severe trepidations and culturally inherited discomfort when it comes to discussions about the matter of their sexuality. To not needlessly offend any Rika that might read this research paper in the future, and in keeping with the spirit imparted on us by our research assistant, we will delay an examination of this matter until we reach a later point in this paper where it will be easier for both the writer and the reader to approach such a topic with the reverence and self-respect it so desperately requires. Returning to the topic of the Rykani quasi-feathers, however, we can now observe the first of only a handful of visually noticeable aspects of their sexual dimorphism, that being their feathers. Many genetic lines of the Rykani ko have developed impressive plumages of shining colors and notable designs in their ranks. Through the information provided to us by our research assistant, we seem pretty confident in our speculation that this trait was developed through an evolutionary process not too dissimilar to those which gave rise to the colorful males of many Earth species. Any ko bearing these impressive plumages would have been put under greater selective risk during the Rika's early history on their home planet, Tvi Rika, as several environmental factors, most notably the existence of many predators of the Rika, would have discriminated against such visually outstanding individuals. At the same time, there also seems to have been at least a short period in the Rykani genetic history during which their care preferentially selected co-exhibiting such remarkable plumages as mates. Importantly, though, it must be stated that our Rykani research assistant, Makuvetai, who is notably a Ke herself, has assured us repeatedly that her sex harbors no such preferences nowadays. It remains unclear, however, if these elaborations were just an expression of a personal opinion or factual statements based on a broader social consensus on this topic. But regardless of the validity of such claims, individual members of the ko, bearing feathers colored in radiant spectra, or wearing pieces of clothing with visually outstanding attributes, can be observed in large quantities wherever the Rika have settled. Most explanations by our Rykani research assistant covering this particular topic center around a distinct sense of culturally inherited defiance, which the ko apparently express in their wearing of such outfits. Although all of these explanations were additionally accompanied by Makuvetai-Sitea's admission that she wasn't born a ko herself, and that her sense for the many particularities of her opposite sex was therefore rather incomplete. A future research effort will have to determine the true nature of Rykani sexual favoritism, but since we still possess only an incomplete picture of this field, a shift of focus to another part of the Rykani physiology seems appropriate. Let us now start at the top of the Rykani stature so that we may gain a quick overview of the most striking features of their kind, starting with the attention-grabbing ears that protrude to either rearward-facing side of the Rykani head. To begin with, it must be noted that the functional mechanisms underlying the Rykani perception of sound, and in part also the utilities of these Rykani ears, share little to no similarities with our human ears. However, once more, given the lack of a better term to describe these Rykani organs, our research team has concluded that the usage of the human term ear seems most suitable for the time being. A detailed description of the many organs that make up the Rykani head, as well as the rest of their body, will follow in the appropriate later chapters of this research article. For this abstract's purposes of a basic observation of the average Rykani phenotype, we can simply note that their kind possesses 2 ears to the back of either side of their head. Towards the front, we find 2 large forward-facing eyes, below which sits the Rykani snout lined with an array of Rykani smelling pores. These smelling pores distinguish themselves from our human nose in a number of aspects. While the human nose is made up of 2 actively ventilated holes, which are connected to the human throat, Rykani smelling pores take the shape of small, passively ventilated indents. A large number of these small indents stretch themselves along the Rykani snout, as well as across parts of the Rykani chin, forehead, and both of their ears, where they sit stealthily below the Rykani covering, ready to pick up the scent of many different chemicals upon their entry. These small indents are, by their nature and placement, rather imprecise in their distinction of different chemicals, as well as their prediction of a scent's possible origin. Additionally, they are very prone to being clogged up by the residue of the Rykani quasi-feathers, and therefore require a continuous cleaning effort, usually in the form of intermittent rubbing actions. Below the Rykani snout sits their mouth, housing all 3 Rykani tongues, and adorned with sharp teeth on both its top and bottom. These quasi-teeth are thin, brittle, off-white in color, and have a propensity of breaking off or falling out easily. They regrow in their entirety approximately once every half cycle, with the Rykani time measure of a cycle, of course, being around 806 days, 23 hours, 38 minutes, and 27.61 seconds of standardized Earth measure long. Moving down from the head, we reach the Rykani spine, where a significant part of their central brain mass situates itself across several thick neck strings made up of dense Rykani neuronal matter. These quasi-neurons, once again, share little structural similarity to our human neurons, but still serve a near identical purpose. Below the shoulders, to either side, sit their 2 upper appendages. These 2 Rykani arms display a physiological somewhat dissimilar, but functionally near identical design to our human arms, and are adorned with 2 hands at either side, consisting of 6 fingers each, of which 2 have degenerated and atrophied beyond the point of external recognition. The remaining functional part of each Rykani hand is made up of an opposable quasi-thumb and 3 quasi-fingers. Below the Rykani shoulders sit the Rykani chest plates, followed by the Rykani waist and the Rykani hips. The back of their hips is adorned by a large tail that extends the Rykani spine and spans a length of anywhere from 60 centimeters to well above a meter. This Rykani tail is adorned by very large quasi-feathers and, through its weight, serves to offset their naturally imbalanced digitigrade posture. On its underside, we find both the Rykani secretion hole, used for the disposal of unneeded or harmful chemicals, and the Rykani genital slit, whose functions will receive further discussion in the appropriate part of this paper. Below the tail, on either side, are positioned the Rykani legs. They are markedly digitigrade in their posture, displaying an extended quasi-metatarsal region, as well as shins that on average tend to be shorter on the Rykani ko than on the Rykani ke. Both legs terminate into the Rykani feet, which are, in turn, segmented into 3 distinct quasi-toes. Finally, each of these quasi-toes terminates into darkened talons of similar fragility and regenerability of the Rykani teeth. Moving on from our physiological description, let us now turn to cover some of the most important Rykani behavioral aspects. As is generally understood today, the Ryka are bipedal creatures that grew up as hunters and gatherers on the cold and desolate plains of their home planet Tvirika. They communicate primarily through oral means, utilizing not only sentences made up of singular words, but also different whistling and hissing noises, whose primary use case lies in giving situational reports on a topic like an individual's health, or warning sleeping members of their satil of possible threats in the surrounding areas. However, the Ryka don't limit their transmissions of information exclusively to the oral realm, and their society has, over time, developed several other means of communication. Primarily, this list includes several types of visual conveyances, such as facial expressions and gestures, both not too dissimilar, at least in concept, to those we humans utilize. Of course, given their differentiating physiology, it should come to no surprise that the Ryka have also integrated movements of their ears and tail into the repertoire of visual communication methods. Similar to some Earth species, raised Rykani ears may express excitement or aggression. A happily bobbing tail may express content, while a lowered, dragging tail could express exhaustion or disappointment. But even beyond the visual and auditory means that the Ryka utilize for their sharing of information, several other, more novel types of communication exist, all of which stand as currently unparalleled by our kind. The most important of these is what the Ryka refer to as direct neural communication, achieved through an interconnection of different Rykani neural control systems, NCS. Using these systems, the Ryka can communicate ideas and thoughts, chat with the minds of individuals all across the galaxy, and share feelings, emotions, and memories with one another. In fact, given the interconnected nature of the Ryka, it is even possible for two separate individuals of their kind to share a single synchronized mental instance made up of two or more separate Rykani brains. The process underlying this collusion of mind is called synchronization, and, according to our research assistant, can generally be regarded as a sign of ultimate trust between two individual Ryka. The topic of trust also brings us to a short excursus on Rykani sociology. The Ryka are social creatures, as can, quite obviously, be gleaned from even the most rudimentary observation of their kind. However, if one considers the full extent of the Rykani social life, as will be discussed in the remainder of this work, it could very well be argued that the Ryka are actually significantly more social than us humans in pretty much all facets of their existence. One must understand that the Ryka, in general, don't ever spend their time alone. Instead, the vast majority of their kind seem to live in what they call a satele, a social unit which, at least from our current observation, shares more than a few similarities to social packs of different earthborn species. The social dynamics within and between these sateles are of course significantly more advanced than those of simple-minded non-sapient earthen species. In fact, it seems sateles come in many different kinds, sizes, forms, and shapes. There seems to be no set standard for how many Ryka, nor which type of Ryka specifically can participate in a single satele. Even more curious, then, are later reports on observations that at least some Ryka do, in fact, live outside of the satele structure. While these Ryka are not often found in the open, our own research assistant was, in truth, one such Ryka. When pressed on the issue, she sadly proved unwilling to provide a more detailed explanation of this phenomenon. However, from what we have gleaned across several interactions involving other Ryka, it seems that some of their kind do, at least in some points in their lives, leave their satele, whereafter they spend a not insignificant amount of time searching for new fitting individuals with which they can then form a new satele. One must, at this point, also understand that the Rykani satele is not necessarily just a grouping of socially amicable individuals. Instead, these pack-like structures derive most of their current nature from the ancient Rykani tribes, wherein certain individuals banded together in highly specialized, task-oriented groupings that centered around accomplishing a single field of work, such as childcare, construction, or hunting. This task-based thinking permeates the Rykani satele-based society, to a point where it could well be argued that the modern satele is actually just as much of an economic labor unit as it is a coherent form of social organization. From what our Rykani assistant has told us, it seems that all common sateles form themselves around a specific economic job, and that Rykani individuals often join a satele for the opportunity of carrying out a particular line of work, rather than for the prospect of being together with other Ryka they enjoy the company of. Although we have also been told of numerous exceptions to this rule, and our own research assistant has told us that a certain ephemeral sense of social compatibility still forms the basis of any stable satele. Perplexingly, though, these Rykani sateles do form social units of incredible cohesion and consistency, despite their mostly economic nature. While we humans are familiar with work environments in which individuals switch their occupation rather frequently, especially once outside economic pressures are applied, the Rykani satele excels in its stability and predictability. While we have been unable to determine an average lifespan for the average satele within this paper, we do provide evidence suggesting that these packs typically last from around 100 to several tens of thousands of Earth years. This large variance in the ages of different satiles seems to be heavily influenced by multiple factors, such as the job that the given satile is carrying out, its current economic viability and social prestige, as well as the exact relations that link the different satile members. Of course, it is hard for us humans to imagine a society composed of such social units. For most, the thought of living together with their co-workers for 100 to 1,000 years at a time would seem nothing short of repulsive. But for the Rykani, whose society has been centered around the satile structure since the time before the first recorded histories, our human isolate lifestyle, in turn, appears similarly absurd. As one would imagine, the bonds between members of a Rykani satile grow quite intimate in the time they shared together, and intersatile relationship states are often quite developed, even if these relationships don't necessarily take the shape of what we humans would consider to be friendships or romances. Satile members also spend most of their time together with other members of that same satile, even outside of working hours. They usually live together, often in single-room living spaces, sleep together, eat together, and undertake recreational activities together. Sadly, because of our limited access to primary Rykani sources, the exact bounds of this closely tied living are not currently all that well known. We have been told that it is rather uncommon for satile members to share their clothes or currencies or most individual possessions. At the same time, however, the Rykani seem to have no reservations against sharing their food, drink, and even relationship states. See Chapter 4, Subchapter 13 for the concept of a trinek. Of course, the entire field of Rykani relationships makes for a rather complex topic in itself. By now, most every human is, at least in some form, aware of the Rykani relationship chart and its exclusionary nature as relates to the different member types within. An in-depth discussion of the relationship chart will be put off until the appropriate section of this study. However, given its function as a seemingly artificial blockade of Rykani human relations, a short discussion of it still seems warranted at this point. Of course, the current human perception of the relationship chart and its function within Rykani society is nothing short of holistically negative. This can be attributed to a large number of different reasons, all of which can most easily be summarized as a human belief that deems the relationship chart to be nothing more than a confusing and seemingly arbitrary wall sitting between what could otherwise be a mostly peaceful and equitable coexistence between our species. However, upon further examination, it quickly becomes apparent that such is simply not the case. One must understand that the Rykani have developed a cohesive system of exchange and interaction which governs the peaceful coexistence of its trillions, if not quadrillions, of members. The stability of this societal framework is wholly dependent on the guidance of many culturally inherited norms, regulations, and expectations to preserve its inner cohesion, and all of these aspects of societal regulation, in turn, are simply expressions of their history, biology, and psychology. Rykani society, with its large list of nuances and particularities that also includes the relationship chart, therefore stands as nothing more than an extended articulation of the natural Rykani way of life, as has evolved on their home planet. If we apply this knowledge to the relationship chart, we quickly come to realize that it itself, as well as its exclusionary nature, is only a manifestation of several more fundamental issues underlying the evolved Rykani sociology. So, to truly understand the relationship chart, its meaning to the Rykani, and why exactly such a strict hierarchical order gains such importance to an otherwise seemingly chaotic species, one must try to trace its origins back to the early history of the Rykani species. Having first evolved in the equatorial swamps of Rykani, the Rykani themselves spent most of their early history living as tribes that spread thinly across the vast icy plains both north and south of the equator. These tribes lived a nomadic lifestyle, and only later in their single-planet history did more permanent settlements develop around the many lakes of this temperate equator. The Rykani population densities, outside of their equatorial home regions, are described to have been minuscule for most of this history, primarily as a result of the abhorrent living conditions in these harsh and hostile environments of both north and south. Their hard-fought existence required the few tribes that populated either side of the equator to live together in harmony, avoiding unnecessary disputes and supporting each other as outside conditions required. This need for cooperation was then further reinforced by the actions of the primary Rykani predator, whose race is given the name Para. The Para were said to be towering, strong, and violent creatures of an intelligence barely trailing that of the Ryka. They lived as social isolates within the many caves of Twirika and hunted other living creatures for sustenance. While the Para's diet partially paralleled that of the Ryka, and that critters served as their chief source of nourishment, the meager pickings of the icy plains turned isolated groups of Ryka into an attractive alternative for starving Para. With a series of attacks along the plains of Twirika began a vicious fight for survival between both the Para and the Ryka, the stories of which make up the vast majority of all surviving Rykani historical documents covering their tribal period. To succeed against the physical prowess of the larger Para, the short and slender Ryka had to develop more strategic means of fighting their arch-nemesis. Rykani individuals, venturing outside of the equatorial home forests, soon learned that larger groups had an easier time fighting off attacks by single Para. Therefore, a first Rykani response to the Para attacks was the formation of well-armed roaming groups. These first Rykani packs then ventured further into their planet's northern and southern regions, driven by an inherent sense of exploration, and eventually found locations suitable for settlement, forming the first semi-sedentary ancient hemispherical tribes. As time went on, and as the number of tribes in these regions grew, small collections of these tribes would also form the first tribal unions, which would facilitate the first Rykani ventures into topics of trade and mutual defense. Throughout all of these consolidation steps, single Ryka were required to sacrifice parts of their individuality and to put aside any existing disagreements or rivalries in order to coordinate as best as possible with their surrounding pack and tribe members. After all, in such hostile environments, any bit of intra-species bickering or hostility made for an existential threat. These dreadful circumstances reinforced an evolutionary mechanism that specifically discriminated in favor of conformist, collectivist, and socially amicable individuals. Hyper-individualists usually perished in the hemispherical plains and mountain ranges and were simply forced to stay behind in the equatorial forests, where living conditions remained significantly less brutal. Through this mechanism of geographically based social selection, the conditions of Twirika facilitated the parallel evolution of two fundamentally incompatible Rykani societies, one of equatorial individualists and one of hemispherical collectivists. This split development within Rykani history is a key contributor to many oddities and contradictions observable in modern Rykani sociology, and will be the subject of the 5th chapter of this study. However, in keeping with a brevity fit for this abstract, we will simply provide a summary of the sociological development for now. The Rykani hemispherical tribes, with their defensive nature and cooperative spirit, were close-knit, militaristic, and collectivist unions. Single tribes, while most often isolated geographically from one another, regularly formed up into large hunting satills, whose main purpose was to investigate and eliminate any Para nest that was reported to be nearby. Once their job was successfully carried out, any spoils of the hunt would be shared equally between the different tribes, and if any romantic relationships formed during these hunts, then a shuffling of individual tribe members was nothing out of the ordinary. But even outside of their united hunts, the tribes of both hemispheres would support each other with gifts of food, weapons, tools, clothing, and tents. The delivery of these gifts was the job of short-lived envoy satills, whose dangerous treks across desolate regions, which offered nothing but snowbound critters and mushrooms found in all too often Para-infested caves as food, often stretched on for several weeks or months. Given these dangerous travel conditions, it comes with little surprise that these envoy satills apparently enjoyed the earnest reverence and best treatment of both their home and destination tribes. Upon arrival, the surviving members of any envoy satill were pampered with the best of housing, food, drink, clothing, and entertainment a Rykani tribe could spare. Before leaving, the envoy Setil and their destination tribe would then exchange pleasantries, notes, histories, gifts, and later on new production methods and even the first conceptions of language, songwriting, and art. In totality, all these factors turned the tribal Ryka into an outward-facing species of incredible inner cohesion, even despite the huge role tribal allegiances played during their tribal age. During the same time frame, the sedentary equatorial tribes developed into prosperous cities that soon facilitated the development of modern agriculture, customs, and technology. These innovations would spread from the equatorial homes into the receptive hands of the hemispherical tribes, who would eventually utilize the first Rykani firearms to free their kind of the para menace for good. However, by this point in Rykani history, even the death of the last para couldn't shake the social structure that had developed across the previous centuries of struggle. The inner social coherence of the Ryka went on to survive not only their modern times, but also their extended history of living spread out across what we now assume to be at least several thousands of different planets. To this day, the Ryka live in a society that shows great friendliness, great understanding, and a great willingness to share with or help others between their ranks, even individuals they haven't previously met. It is not uncommon to see Ryka play a great assortment of different games with each other, out in their open markets, as even their adults enjoy a great sense for play and mischief. The Ryka, it seems, are living in what some of us humans in the past could have almost conceptualized to be a utopia of sorts, given the close cohesion between their ranks, the technology which allows for easy sharing of personal information, and the in general quite close lifestyle of the Ryka, which discriminates against all individuals living a reluctant, isolated, and secretive lifestyle. However, Rykani sociology wasn't the only thing to have been influenced by their history. Just as their culture is marked by signs of their early struggle, so can we also find remaining scars bearing heavily on their modern psychology that express themselves most notably in their carrying of weapons pretty much wherever they go. It is incredibly rare to see a Ryka completely unarmed, and if you go out to the few reconstruction projects currently involving shared human Ryka work contingents, of which there are as of writing still very few, you will see pretty much all individuals of their kind heavily armed and either carrying their guns around their waist or across their shoulders. The many weapons they carry, each of a different design and utilizing different technologies, of course, still are tools that serve only one purpose: to kill. As our kind has learned from the unfortunate treaty war, Rykani weapons are more than marvels of engineering. They are highly lethal and highly dangerous to anything living or dead, two attributes that the average human will generally observe with great concern. Of course, having learned about the first facets of Rykani history, it becomes easier for us to understand why exactly the Ryka show such a favor towards their personal weaponry, and the right to carry them wherever they please, even when asked by us humans to disarm themselves. In some ways, it could be argued that the Ryka are simply paranoid creatures, forever haunted by their early history, always on the lookout for enemies that have long since perished, and remaining wary of any potential external threats. Under this newly gained cultural lens, we may also critically re-examine the events that initially led up to what is now known to us as the Treaty War, a conflict without any clear goals that saw human society pushed to the brink of collapse. As can now be understood, the Rykani society is one of incredible inner coherence, stability, and harmony. Their kind had enjoyed a closely knit lifestyle since before a time their history recalls, and unified both its language and governance under a sole hierarchical structure just as soon as societal and technological advancements permitted. The previously discussed societal paranoia, the same tool that had forged the Ryka together in their early history, allowed them to prevail against the para, brought them into modernity, gave them the culture and wealth they enjoy today, and ultimately shaped their society into what we now see before us remains a shared attribute between all Rykani individuals to this day. And in opposition to the synergic and well-armed Rykani collective stand us humans. Our species has known inner strife like perhaps no other sapient race in this universe, and we still experience and live through facets of the same strife today. Given humanity's long and devastating history of inner and intraspecies wars, it therefore made sense, in our mind, for us to extend a branch of peace towards the Ryka after our first mutual contact. Human diplomats of the time wanted nothing more than to let their new alien mutuals know of our disinterest in an intergalactic war, and to have the Ryka understand that our race had, long ago, cast its dark history of deadly conflicts into the shadows of history. Interspecies cooperation was the idea that sought to bring all into the future, which is why the Terran Council, at the time, was so insistent on having the Ryka sign a treaty demarcating and stabilizing the frontier between our two races. However, the Ryka, who were sitting in quiet puzzlement at the receiving end of all this human gesturing, had little to no understanding of the great symbolism and well-meant intentions underlying all such actions. Interspecies relations then quickly turned for the worse, as our first official delegations sought to establish contact and converse with the Ryka without ever having declared a shared state in a relationship chart, although the resulting cultural offense may have been both inevitable and unmitigatable given the chart's exclusionary nature. Regardless of the original inevitability, however, cultural tensions soon flared up in a significantly more impactful fashion as the topic of the human proposed treaty came into the spotlight. As is well understood today, the Ryka resisted repeated calls for both a negotiation of this treaty's terms and its signing, meaning that humanity had to contend itself with a constant stream of uncooperative Rykani intruders into human-controlled orbits, airspaces, and settlements. Unsurprisingly, such actions weren't much appreciated by affected communities and local politicians, some of whom rightfully concluded that any such unstoppable alien incursions could pose a serious threat to humanity's collective security. Of course, the Ryka, for their part, saw many good reasons that spoke against the signing of the treaty they were presented with, the most important of which stems from the fact that their kind had never previously experienced the concurrent existence of multiple rival governments. Across the entirety of modern Rykani history, all of their administrative institutions had always subordinated themselves to the absolute authority of an all-encompassing entity known to us as the Directorate. The unquestioned laissez-faire rule of the tribally elected director and his governing satil grants its many socio-economic constituent bodies far-reaching liberties on how to conduct themselves. From our research, it appears most likely that formal rules and regulations limit themselves to the bare essentials necessary to avoid border disputes and mishaps on what our research assistant has called intra-universal research. The only exception to this rule appears to be the Directorate's enforcement of its claim to the title of sole Rykani sovereign and guarantor of these aforementioned liberties, in which no compromise is accepted. Naturally, the existence of such a directorate has broad ramifications for the political culture of the Ryka. If we return to our previous topic of the human proposed demarcation treaty, we can now, perhaps, gain a basic understanding of the many Rykani trepidations concerning the signing of such a document. Simply put, the Ryka had never before contemplated the necessity of having their supreme authority enter a binding treaty with another governing body, which is why no avenues for the conclusion of such an agreement existed in the first place. Even worse, the human treaty's inclusion of territorial settlements that would inevitably infringe on the Rykani populace's freedom of movement upon its ratification meant that the non-interventionist directorate, the only governing body that ruled over all Ryka, actually lacked any and all authority to ever sign such legislation into effect. There remained plainly no way for the Ryka to sign off on our so-called Treaty of Friendship, even if they'd wished to do so. With this newly gained information, it now becomes possible for us to put the events that led up to the treaty war into a new context. The data we have gathered as a part of the study has led us to believe that the Rykani likely didn't actually ignore our question for the signing of a mutual treaty, nor that they left us in the cold or were even that unwilling to engage in any diplomacy with us. Far worse than that, even if the Rykani had proven themselves to be unwilling to contemplate our treaties, the cause might now be a lot more understandable to our kind. After all, leaders at the time were using the threat of arms to push a government to sign a binding agreement that would have limited the freedom of its citizens, despite the fact that the same institution had no authority over such matters to begin with. Further conversations have also revealed that at least some Rykani actually did try to understand the significance of our treaty, leading them to ask different parts of their government for reaction to our offers. However, lacking the power to sign a treaty that would bind all Rykani individuals equally, the Directorate remained completely incapable of responding to such a situation. Ultimately, the Treaty of Friendship, the biggest point of contention between our two species, and the item that eventually gave its name to the ensuing conflict, was nothing more than an idyllic piece of symbol politics, lacking in both its attachments to reality and in its avenues of enforceability. By the time the unfortunate collision of the planet of Provo took place, we humans, even despite all the slowdowns that came from our lack of FTL communications, were still going too fast. We were jumping to a threatening conclusion over the intentions of the Rykani, and soon readied ourselves for war with a species that had, in the words of the time, maliciously ignored us for years, proven itself unwilling to engage in even the slightest bit of dialogue, and had now taken several thousand human lives in its reckless violation of our sovereignty. Meanwhile, the Rykani, from what we have been told by our research assistant, were clueless about the effects their behavior had on the human psyche. They remained confused about our demands and had still not managed to find a way of dealing with us by the time the first human orbital munitions fell on the surface of Sethka. Zetarenberger's blatant act of war put an end to that confusion. All Rykani insecurities on how to handle this new species vanished once these first shots were fired, and then came the inevitable. As Berger's forces attacked civilian Rykani settlements and shipping with, at best, moderate effects, news of our aggression spread at hyperlight speeds across the galaxy, and the Rykani had suddenly found their new parent. A new enemy of similar intelligence to theirs was once more threatening to wipe their kind out for good. Within days, billions of Rykani had followed the call for action and were headed for battle. Of course, only very few members within the Terran Council agreed with the decision to go to war, and we now know that Zetarenberger's first acts of the treaty war were wholly unsanctioned. Indeed, it would take another 12 years until the first interstellar craft carrying news of the collision over Provo and Berger's preparations for war came into Earth's orbit. But for the Rykani, such minutiae made no difference. With the attack on Sethka, their patience with the oddities of human diplomacy had officially run dry. Humanity and the Rykani were at war. Regardless of humanity's initial jingoistic optimism, however, their forces were soon faced with an enemy that enjoyed a distinct technological superiority in all disciplines. By the end of the treaty war, we humans had effectively lost every single battle we engaged in, and caused no more than a few thousand Rykani casualties, even by the most optimistic estimates. After the bombing of Earth, the subsequent incineration of the Terran Council, and killing of over 1.5 billion humans, humanity was faced with but two prospects: death or defeat. It was only through skilled negotiation and a good heap of luck that human diplomats eventually managed to stave off the former and accomplish the latter, at least for the time being. But the scars of the treaty war run deep even now, almost 3 decades later. The death of all but a few sitting members of the Terran Council has brought upon humanity this newest period of strife, and the new Terran Council, only recently reformed, seems almost helpless against the growing unrest tearing through the outer worlds. Day by day, new factions declare their independence from the rule of Terra, each more radical than the last, and each more willing to throw away its civility in its search for a new beginning of humanity than the previous. For our newly developed perspective on the matter, the events that transpired in and around the treaty war seem more unfortunate than ever before. But still, there remains hope for humanity, as the Rykani, in spite of their societal paranoia and our blatant acts of, in their eyes, unjustified aggression, have nonetheless already proven themselves to be at least in part willing to engage with us. So far, we've had the great honor of being assisted by a single Rykani, Makuvetai, whose name will no doubt have already entered the history books by the time this study is published. In the future, the number of Rykani willing to converse with us humans will hopefully grow further, but for now, a single point of contact is all that humanity possesses in its pursuit of opening a door for what could one day be an era of interspecies cooperation. Of course, no such cooperation can take place if we simply ignore or try to bury the things that have taken place over the last few decades. If we are ever to engage with the Rykani in a peaceful, or at least less than hostile, fashion, we have to become finely tuned to the Rykani psychology, their sociology, and the many cultural differences that stand between our kinds. That is why I, Timo Hannes, as well as the other members of this research team, hereby propose the introduction of a complete ban on human-Rykani interactions until further notice. It has become quite apparent that if we humans are ever to successfully engage with the Rykani in a manner that is both productive and amicable to individuals of all sides, we will need to develop a framework for which such acts can occur. The development of this framework will not be a quick action, but a drawn-out process, taking perhaps decades, if not centuries. To fasten this process, we additionally propose the formation of a small institution dedicated to the cause of interspecies research, similar in structure to the Galvin Nexus Physics Institute situated on the planet of Progress. With adequate funding, even a rudimentary research foundation should, eventually, be able to develop a social rule set that will allow us humans to engage safely with individuals of the Rykani race. And only once such a framework stands should humanity, at large, interact with our new galactic mutuals. Only then should we turn our eyes to the Rykani in an attempt to apologize for what we have done. Only then should we even contemplate the idea of a shared future. Only then should we try to kickstart initiatives that will allow for greater interspecies cooperation. And only then can we ever consider working with the Rykani on adapting some of their technological capabilities for our uses. Any interaction with the Rykani ahead of the development of such a framework has to be seen as a fundamental threat to humanity's continued existence. At this moment in time, any small misstep could toss our species back into another war, one that humanity would likely not survive. For this reason, our Research Council also proposes the introduction of the harshest measures of punishment for any unsolicited contact with the Rykani. The current situation is nothing but dire, and it seems increasingly likely that humanity may indeed be headed into the darkest chapter of its known history. Even leaving aside the devastation caused by the treaty war, the many dead, sick, wounded, the many starving, the many dying of diseases that were supposedly wiped out centuries ago, we now face perhaps the single most critical era in human history, and it is safe to say that we humans are unprepared and under-equipped to deal with what is to come. Yet, on this day, the 12th of June, 3217 Common Era, humanity has taken its first major step on what will no doubt be a long and arduous journey towards the understanding of a species that is so distant from ours. As the proposition, funding, and final conclusion of this first landmark study into the Rykani has shown, such a first step is never easy to take. However, with the knowledge contained in this paper below, we hope to equip the brightest minds of humanity's future with the tools and capabilities needed to full end this journey that our species has now set out upon. It is the wish of not just myself, but of all researchers within my team, that humanity may foster a greater understanding of our newly found galactic neighbors. This definition doesn't just include the Rykani, of course, as the recent findings on the planet of Katkaxa have simply served to further undermine the importance of fostering a new human code of conduct adapted to the new galactic reality which we now face. All of us have dedicated the last few years of our all too short lives in order to prepare humanity for a future that, as we now know, has to take place in a universe where several intelligent species may tolerate each other, lest we be destroyed. The following chapters of the study will now go over the details of the Rykani species, one after the other. For the first section to follow this rather unintentionally expanded introduction, we will explore the Rykani genetics and microbiology. For navigational help across the topics to come, please consult the following table of contents for a full list of all the chapters contained within this scientific paper. Taken from pages 1 and 2 and 6 to 23 of the abstract to Timo Hannes' landmark study, An Introduction to the Rykani, dated 19th of September 3217 CE, Jakob Alex University of Kranz. Attributed to Timo Hannes, Sharm Mohat, Said Malik, Carsten Vance, Naira Yoko, Mickey Saul, Roald de Kedmont, Nuach Chiro, Sota Yohamin, Isha Mose, Ako Bosidin, Ewa Kuzuke, Isha Maxim, Makuve Tai Siteya, et alia.